Welcome to History for Granite. Join me to explore ancient Egypt. Please subscribe, and together we'll uncover secrets from the past written in stone. The Great Pyramid of Gizeh is one of humanity's most inspiring achievements, a testament to the power of creativity to manifest wonders beyond belief. Today, I am truly excited to discuss my favorite part of this great wonder, the Portcullis antechamber which sealed the king's chamber. But before we dive in, I must begin with some words of caution. Once you go through this door with me, there is no going back. We are going so far down the rabbit hole that I must reveal many secrets to explain a grand new theory. My best analogy for the Great Pyramid is that it is civilization's greatest magic trick. In this video, I hope you will be dazzled and delighted as I do my best to deconstruct this masterpiece. But after time has passed, there may be some mixed feelings about the mystery which is no longer there. Don't worry, we have plenty of other puzzles to examine. However, this may be the very biggest. Like a magic trick, once you know how it all works, you never quite see it the same way again. Don't say, I didn't warn you. The concept of tomb security is what grabbed my attention when I first started researching the pyramids of Egypt. After giving myself permission to take this work seriously, I was engaged in an endless series of hypothetical scenarios. If I were a pharaoh, how would I best secure a pyramid? And if I were a robber, what methods would I use to attack a fortified tomb? It's easy to see in the present that no physical barrier can prevent humans from intruding upon a burial filled with treasure given enough time and visibility. This obvious observation gave rise to the idea the pyramids were a great folly and the Egyptians great fools for prominently advertising royal burials. But surely everyone can see, in order to construct these mighty pyramids, that true genius was at work. As such, it is the height of arrogance to assume the minds responsible didn't understand the ramifications of their actions. The rise of 4th Dynasty pyramids came suddenly, following early Egyptian dynasties that contained an arms race of larger mastabas with increasingly heavy portcullis blocking stones. I am grateful for Egyptologist Reg Clark's books on tomb security, which trace the evolution of how early dynastic burials were fortified. Clark deserves credit for being the first Egyptologist to examine tomb security in a comprehensive way. Here is a brief summary of security methods used before the Great Pyramid. The catch-22 of completing a tomb in anticipation of your death is that it requires a passage to enter the burial and lay the deceased to rest. No matter how deep you dig, nor how large the mastaba above may get, there was still a passage created for the body to arrive at its destination. In spite of Egyptians backfilling this passage, it was easier to dig through and would obviously lead to the burial location below. It is evident from the constantly changing layout of tomb entrances that mastabas were being plundered very soon after burials were completed. A security innovation that began during Egypt's 1st dynasty was that of a portcullis. The idea was a stone wider than the entrance passage could be lowered into it from above after a burial. A small vertical groove, called an emplacement, would allow the portcullis to seal a completed tomb from the outside. Then the emplacement would be filled up, and the portcullis could no longer be moved. These early dynastic portcullises were made of limestone or sandstone, and this was often a harder material than the surrounding bedrock and backfill. In this era, many tomb robbers would not have the tools or skill set to penetrate the harder stone, and thus the portcullis would be a formidable barrier. There are examples of tomb robbers going to great lengths to avoid attacking a portcullis directly. Sometimes they would even dig out the entire portcullis emplacement just to be able to tilt or lever it out of place and sneak past. The mightiest mastabas of the early dynastic period used increasingly large portcullises, weighing up to 42,000 pounds. Often more than one was used, and even up to 6 separate slabs blocked a single passage. Under the first stepped pyramid of 3rd Dynasty pharaoh Djoser, a few burial shafts were found to have portcullises similar to the mastabas of its era. The earliest pyramid to contain a portcullis within it was the bent pyramid of Snefru first king of the 4th dynasty. Notably, the only portcullis within it that could have sealed the upper chamber was never closed. After the reign of Snefru, portcullises are no longer found within Mastaba burials. At Gizeh, the pyramids are the only prominent tombs to use them. The next pharaoh after Snefru was his son Khufu, who set out to build the largest pyramid of all time. When the Great Pyramid arrived at Gizeh, it was the very first crypt to use a portcullis made of granite. We know this because the antechamber is made of granite, and surviving fragments of the portcullis are still found within the pyramid. I previously made a video about the surviving pieces, however, I misidentified one in the grotto. The portcullis fragment is the squared block in the floor, and this other stone which confused me is something else that has not been identified. The design of Khufu's portcullis antechamber is complex, and previous efforts at reconstructing it often invent pieces for which there is no physical evidence to back up such claims. I confess, when I set out to understand this space, I was quite intimidated. Observing the interplay of granite and limestone blocks in a net diagram of the room provoked the question, how can anyone ever hope to understand the logic that crafted this machine? It felt as though I was looking at the Antikythera mechanism right after it was plucked out of the ocean. You could tell something smart was going on, even if pieces were damaged and missing. The known parts to this portcullis chamber are as follows. The room is entered from the top of the Grand Gallery through a short passage about 103 centimeters wide and 112 centimeters tall. The blocks around this passage making up the wall between the rooms are made of limestone. This may be a conservation of granite material because the real defense lay beyond this short entrance. The room itself is 3.8 meters tall, and upon entering there is a 54 centimeter gap that one can immediately stand up within. In front of this gap are 2 granite beams stacked on top of each other and suspended in air by extending into the side walls. These 2 blocks are colloquially known as the granite leaf. The open passage beneath the granite leaf has approximately the same dimensions of the corridor in which one enters the room from the north. Behind and to the south of the granite leaf are 3 portcullis emplacements, each 55 centimeters deep. They are very closely spaced together, with only 15 centimeters between them, as seen from the vertical protrusions in both walls. The space between the granite leaf and the first portcullis is even smaller, at 8 centimeters. The upper part of the antechamber is wider than the portcullis emplacements, with wainscot ledges adding 21 centimeters of width to the room on both sides. These 2 wainscots are notably different, with the western one being slightly higher and containing 3 semicircular grooves, each located above a portcullis emplacement. The height of the eastern wainscot is approximately level with the bottom of the grooves that are cut into the western one. Finally, at the end of the chamber on its southern wall, there are 4 thin vertical grooves carved into the lintel above the corridor leading to the king's chamber. At the top of this lintel, an anomalous strip of limestone is found. Whether or not this limestone was designed to cushion the lintel or simply conserving granite where it was not needed is up for debate. A few researchers have expressed concern over the fact that the thin vertical grooves taper dramatically smaller at the bottom. Flinders Petrie even thought that in the damaged section the grooves would have entirely closed up. But a few measurements and basic math tell us the portcullis stones could project up to 40 centimeters above the corridor to the king's chamber. Since we have the top sections of multiple portcullis stones, and their rope holes are only 21 centimeters from the top of the block, that is plenty of clearance for the portcullis holes to overlap the grooves before they taper shut. The obvious consequence is that ropes could be threaded down the grooves and through the portcullis holes to maneuver the southern stone directly against the wall with a tight fit. The maneuvering of portcullis stones with ropes is a key point of inquiry, which takes us back to earlier uses in Mastaba burials. Some portcullis blocks in Mastabas had rope holes, including examples of the largest ones. A controlled descent for enormous stones would be desirable and easily facilitated for a mastaba, where at the top you have space for unlimited manpower. The unknown variable is what rigging the Egyptians used to change the direction of force from the portcullis pulling down to the workers pulling horizontally. The cramped space of the portcullis chamber is not comparable to what could be accomplished in the open air above a mastaba, and this is a point we will return to later in the video. The most important question about the Great Pyramid's portcullis is why it was designed in such a way that anyone could climb over the granite leaf to the area above the stones where the rigging for ropes and logs existed. Conventional wisdom says this is an enormous security flaw, as highlighted by Dieter Arnold in his seminal book on construction titled Building in Egypt. Quote, "The system was rather naive because the robbers could easily climb over the lowered portcullises through the maneuvering chamber and chisel off enough of the granite of the architrave over the entrance door." End quote. It's likely that Arnold's description is exactly what happened because of the visible damage to the ceiling of the corridor behind the southern portcullis stone. Calling the builders of the Great Pyramid naive is a polite way of saying they were great fools, and this is where my curiosity went into overdrive. The statement simply did not ring true to me, and thus I decided an alternative explanation was warranted. If anyone wants to accuse me of bias, I will lay it out right here for you. A goal of my investigation was to see if I could understand the Great Pyramid's portcullis in a manner that was explainable beyond naivete. This brings us to the perspective of the robbers of antiquity and how they would attack a tomb's defenses. There are 3 methods for attacking a portcullis. 1, it can be levered or pried out of position to navigate under it. 2, it can be attacked directly and demolished. 3, it can be circumvented by digging around it. The distinction between digging through a portcullis and digging around it only matters if they are made from different types of stone. Thus, the material of the blockage is the most important factor for that type of attack. Next, it must be considered how much time and effort each type of attack would require. Obviously, this will vary greatly based upon the skill of the intruders and the amount of material they must excavate. My loose estimate of time required for such attacks are as follows. Levering a portcullis would take hours to days. Digging through limestone would take days to weeks. Digging through granite would take weeks to months. Even with that simple of a threat matrix, you can see why levering attacks would be considered the most serious. It's the only potential method where intruders might overwhelm security or sneak undetected and penetrate a tomb within a single night. For mastabas, the portcullis was lowered in from the outside and its emplacement filled up. Therefore, a levering attack would at least require some excavation beforehand. But in pyramids, a portcullis required empty space to hold it in position before being closed, and thus they were immediately vulnerable to levering. With that basic understanding, it's clear the threat of levering is what a pyramid architect would be overly concerned with. Compounding this concern is that the pharaoh has trained a literal army of workers in the skill of levering to construct the pyramid with years of practice under their belts. It is obvious the ancient Egyptians were aware of this vulnerability because the earliest portcullis design within the bent pyramid completely neutralizes a levering attack. The portcullis stone slides at an oblique angle and penetrates deep below the level of the floor. The time it would take intruders to dig out the limestone floor and determine which direction the stone could be levered would be equal or greater than the time it would take to penetrate the limestone blockage itself. The risk of a single night breach is therefore eliminated. This model of understanding allows us to evaluate the next pyramid portcullis design, the one within the Great Pyramid. A key requirement for a levering attack is vertical clearance because levers are long and maneuvering space is a limiting factor in their effectiveness. This limitation may be the primary reason why so many pyramid corridors have small dimensions, not much more than a square meter. The granite leaf constrains the clearance for a levering attack on the first portcullis down to the height of the corridor. This closest portcullis could still be levered by a skilled crew. However, the key question is how high up it could be lifted. The higher the stone is elevated, the less vertical clearance there is to manipulate a lever. It gets dramatically more difficult as the block is raised, and the halfway point is probably the best that could be accomplished quickly. This reveals the ingenious defense provided by 3 portcullis stones in close proximity. The first stone might be levered up about 55 centimeters, but then it protects the next stone, which could only be levered half of that, and by the time you get to the last portcullis, only about 14 centimeters of lift can be accomplished. This is smaller than the skull of an adult human and not enough space to sneak under. If a levering attack could have been accomplished at the Great Pyramid, the time required would be significantly more than a single night. The only alternative was to break through granite, and even though only the inner portcullis stone protects from such an attack, the time required to achieve this would be significant. We have eliminated naivete as a factor in the Great Pyramid's portcullis design, but this in turn raises more questions. Why did the Egyptians change so dramatically from the bent pyramid's design, which was constructed with the same anti-levering principles? It was logical to lower portcullis stones with ropes in mastabas because of the significant vertical distance they needed to travel and the maneuvering point existing from above. Neither of these factors is true for the Great Pyramid, and so the reasoning for the rope method is not obvious. Lowering a portcullis without ropes was done in almost every pyramid after the Great Pyramid, but I find it unlikely Khufu's architects weren't aware of such methods. It's still a bit of tricky work. The vertical supports under the heavy stone may need to be hammered out a bit, and then perhaps a rope was tied to the supports, so a sudden yank from a work crew could create the force necessary to pull them out. The question of how rope rigging for the portcullis stones was arranged in the Great Pyramid is a complex problem that I will speculate more about in a future video. The bigger problem is that each granite block weighed about 4,500 pounds, and lowering that amount of weight in a controlled manner requires a lot of manpower. There's no point in using ropes for the portcullis stones if they are to come crashing down uncontrolled, so how did the Egyptians harness the force necessary to accomplish this? The portcullis antechamber only contains enough space for a few people, and their strength alone would have a negligible impact on pulling against 4,500 pounds. I am aware that some ingenious methods involving counterweights or increased friction may be hypothesized, but since no other portcullis could have used those techniques, I find such speculations unlikely. Fortunately, the Grand Gallery is very close to the portcullis antechamber, which has ample space for the manpower required to control 4,500 pounds of weight. The exact manner by which the ropes were directed into the Grand Gallery is uncertain, and again we'll save that analysis for another video. But whatever the method, it wasn't more complex than rigging models proposed in Building in Egypt by Dieter Arnold. We've now covered the method of controlling the Great Pyramid's portcullis, but the deeper question of why it was designed this way is far more important. Why so greatly complicate the lowering of these granite blocks when simpler methods were used before and after? Why questions are the tough ones, and they require evidence far stronger than speculations about the rigging of ropes. We need to simplify our reconstruction to its most basic functionality, moving a portcullis from the open position to the closed one. The key piece of evidence will be found on the floor of the portcullis chamber, where slots were made for supports that would hold the stones in their elevated position. Supports under the stones would be the only method of holding the blocks up in every other pyramid portcullis that did not use ropes. But there's a critical difference between what we see in every other pyramid's portcullis floor and the floor here at the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is the only portcullis where the slots exist, securing the supports below the level of the floor. Removing supports to let a portcullis fall is the most difficult part of the mechanism. But you can't pull them out if they are embedded under the floor with the weight of the portcullis on top of them. The only way to get the supports out at the Great Pyramid would be to lift the portcullis with the ropes and manpower in the Grand Gallery. Indeed, you would never put slots in the floor if you couldn't do this, which is why no other portcullis has them. And let me be crystal clear on this point. If you can muster the power to lift a portcullis up and off its supports, there is no reason whatsoever that you cannot fully open and close the portcullis repeatedly at will. Even if there were some ingenious methods of removing the supports without lifting the portcullis, there is no angle of attack for them except directly under the granite blocks themselves. It is crazy to think anyone would attempt to release a portcullis while underneath it. The ability to raise and lower the portcullis repeatedly is the critical answer of why it was designed this way in the Great Pyramid. And once you understand that point, the full brilliance of the design becomes apparent. It's openable, but still secure against a levering attack. You need a large team to open it, probably about 30 men. But with the rigging kept out of sight from the Grand Gallery, knowledge of its precise operation was hidden from the muscle used to pull it open. The portcullis is thus a lockable door, secured with the secrecy of its operation and a physical barrier that only a prolonged attack could penetrate. This design was not naive. This was true genius at work. When solving this puzzle years ago, I was quite pleased, but I was still operating under a model of pyramids Egyptology hammered into me. My earliest speculation was a lockable door would be necessary in the short term, because filling the room with enormous treasures was more than a day's job, and you'd really want it physically secured. The Great Pyramid's enormous size makes bringing objects inside a long and slow journey. But soon, nagging thoughts grew in my mind. The scolding academic voice that says nothing is special about the Great Pyramid, and that following smaller pyramids fulfill the same purpose. And sure enough, Old Kingdom pyramids that follow Khufu are designed with portcullises that could be opened and shut as well. Levering them up was less elegant, but the builders clearly made the portcullises vulnerable on purpose. It was at this point that I took a long pause in the portcullis work, because the gravity of my proposal started to weigh down on me. I try not to fall in love with my own ideas, and the discoveries were becoming very radical. The physical evidence of the portcullis operation was quite strong. However, fear of missing critical evidence kept holding me back. A reimagining of Old Kingdom pyramids as permanently accessible seemed within reach, but the mental block preventing that conclusion was substantial. I can hear the defenders of conventional wisdom in my head as I write this. But they were plugged! The pyramids were plugged up! Will come the replies of skeptics. Were they now? Were they really? It's very natural to assume long and narrow descending corridors would have been filled with plug stones. They appear designed to accommodate them. Not only that, but the few pyramids which have secondary entrances did have those passages entirely plugged. The unplugging of the Bent Pyramid and Khafre's Pyramid only occurred with modern archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's only natural people have assumed all the main entrances were originally plugged as well. The physical evidence of such plugging, however, does not exist. This point is not even contested within Egyptology. It is merely taken for granted that it must have occurred, even though we can't detect it. Flinders Petrie was the earliest and most capable archaeologist to investigate this matter before later damage occurred in the passages, and here is what he had to say. Quote, "The passages of the pyramids show no trace of continuous plugging, nor indeed any plugging beyond the closing of the mouths of some passages, merely to prevent their being detected. On the contrary, there are incidental proofs in the mortaring, etc., that no general plugging was ever introduced or extracted." End quote. In Reg Clark's books, he bends over backwards trying to explain that Snefru's pyramids must have been plugged entirely, even as he reluctantly admits there is no physical evidence for such plugging. His book ends with the Red Pyramid, and the Great Pyramid is not discussed. For plugging to have occurred, it needed to be the worst job imaginable with smooth rubble, but that's not what we see in plugged passages that were abandoned. It's just assumed that the plugs were 100% cleared out in every pyramid by looters who had perfected the skill of large plug extraction. Since the Great Pyramid is our focus, let's compare it to the pyramids that come right before and after it. Probably the pyramid which directly preceded Khufu was the satellite pyramid to the Bent Pyramid. This is an ideal point of comparison because it did in fact have some plugging. 3 or 4 plug stones were stored in its ascending passage, 2 of which became stuck and never slid into place. This design is the closest thing that we have to the Great Pyramid's ascending corridor with the 3 granite plugs. But why were the Egyptians plugging pyramids from the inside when it would be much easier to do so from the outside? Conventional wisdom said they did both, for the more plugged a pyramid is, the more secure it is. However, here, at the Bent's Satellite Pyramid, there is an aborted robber's tunnel at the bottom of the entrance passage, right before the ascending passage plug blocks that we know existed. Did looters perfectly extract plugs all the way down, only to drastically change tactics when the passage inclined upwards, only to give up and return to removing the plugs? I propose only the ascending passage was plugged, and that robbers, having never seen a plugged pyramid entrance before, attempted to go both around and through them at the same time. Since only 3 meters of plugging slid into place, the notably short tunnel was abandoned as soon as the other team broke through. Now, let's look at the enormous pyramid of Khafre, which follows the Great Pyramid. It had 2 entrances. The secondary one beneath the bedrock was plugged with enormous limestone blocks removed in the 1800s. The main entrance passage is made entirely of granite for the over 30 meters it extends towards a single granite portcullis. Plugging this corridor with granite would seem to be the ultimate defense. Over 30 meters of the hardest stone to penetrate, with no weak points in the floors, walls, or ceiling. But the remains of plugs at Khafre have never been found, yet granite fragments are easy to identify at the Gizeh Plateau. Indeed, there is an enormous amount of granite left over from its lowest angled casing stones, but not a single squared piece that could have belonged to a plug. The robber's tunnel at Khafre is also quite remarkable in that it travels over 40 meters through the pyramid with an angled turn to exit directly beyond the granite portcullis. Surely we can't believe perfectly defeating over 30 meters of granite plugging was accomplished, but the last 37 centimeters of granite portcullis proved too great a defense. The portcullis remains pristine except for the damage Howard Weiss drilled into it in 1837. I propose the robber's tunnel at Khafre finds the perfect exit point because the intruders simply walked down the descending corridor, measured the length to the portcullis, and planned their trajectory accordingly. What the robbers couldn't know was how much granite lay in front of them at the portcullis. Other pyramids contain 3 slabs, and the robbers overshot the single granite stone a bit, hoping to avoid the granite at all costs. They were probably a bit chafed upon discovering only 37 centimeters of granite had originally blocked their path. Now let's look at the Great Pyramid, with its 3 granite plugs having closed the ascending passage. The question must be raised again, why are we plugging the pyramid from this direction inside? It's risky and technically complicated, and many Egyptologists claim the well shaft was needed just for the workers to escape after having finished the job. If the goal was to close the pyramid permanently after a burial, you'd simply push granite plugs from the entrance down as far as you could. It would be way more secure and much less complicated. But there's a deeper question that must be asked. If you're plugging a pyramid, why bother with a portcullis at all? At Khafre, there could have been over 30 meters of granite plugging, so what exactly is a 37 centimeter portcullis contributing in the first place? The only explanation I've ever read is that somehow the portcullis would be a more expedient method of closure. But a single plug adds more defense than the portcullis, and there's plenty of reason to believe releasing a portcullis from its supports is slower and more complicated than pushing a plug down a passage. As I have proposed, the portcullis exists to be opened and closed, and this is why they remain in pyramids. This understanding reveals why the Great Pyramid has its granite plugs in the ascending passage. These plugs within the pyramid can be released at any time. You don't need infrastructure outside the pyramid to store those plugging stones. Indeed, that is the only good reason to plug a pyramid from the interior, so that it can be done long after the pyramid is completed. The granite plugs are a fail-safe security feature, a way to close the Great Pyramid permanently at a much later time. When and why that occurred is a wonderful mystery, and I hope some carbon is trapped within lubrication or plaster on the hidden side of the plugs. Perhaps someday an investigation will reveal the answer. The last pyramids of the Old Kingdom at the end of the 5th and 6th dynasties had a small area near their entrances for a granite plug. But these entrances were at ground level, and the plugging could also have occurred long after those pyramids were completed. In the Pyramid of Niusera, the limestone block which was supposed to backstop the single granite plug slid too far down the corridor, almost as if it was a rushed or sloppy job, just like the earliest example at the satellite pyramid to the bent pyramid, where two plugs never slid into place. Once you understand that Old Kingdom pyramids were made accessible, so many other details start to make sense. It's why the drum roll of a false door was carved above the portcullis, so that visitors could spiritually connect with the king even if they couldn't pass through. It's why the only sarcophagi with lockable lids are found in pyramids, so they would still be secure with visitors in the chamber. It's why we see door hinges at pyramid entrances. It's why Strabo wrote of a movable door at the Great Pyramid in 17 AD. It's why the only Old Kingdom pyramid portcullis that could never be pulleyed or levered open was the only one never sealed. It's why pyramid portcullises are smaller and lighter than the ones found in mastabas built before them. It's why pyramid texts disappear after the Old Kingdom when pyramids were no longer made accessible. It's why robbers' tunnels found their way from the outside of pyramids directly to the portcullis stones. It's why so many pyramids after the Great Pyramid replicate its three successive portcullis design. It's why the only evidence for pyramid plugging is the kind that could be done long after a burial. It's why portcullis stones are no longer found in mastabas with the building of the Great Pyramid. And last but certainly not least, it's why the Great Pyramid King's Chamber was constructed with channels for air. But even with all the evidence in support of a new pyramid security model, there was one last detail that needed an explanation before I was satisfied. The enigma that fuels every ridiculous and half-baked idea about the Great Pyramid. The strange and mysterious layout of the three chambers within the monument. You all know the classic story that the underground chamber and Queen's Chamber were backup burial chambers, built in case the pharaoh died early or some other unforeseen change of plan. That explanation always held a shred of plausibility because these two chambers were indeed unfinished. But neither of those rooms held a sarcophagus, nor were they constructed in a way you could ever intend to bring one in. The underground chamber even has its entrance passage squeezed smaller, which must have made excavating the chamber much more difficult. You would never leave the access point smaller than the final design because of how badly this slows down the work. And the Queen's Chamber looks nothing like the King's Chamber, so how could it be intended to fulfill the same purpose? It wasn't until I got a look at the top of the chimney in the bent pyramid that the answer finally revealed itself. For the bent pyramid is the model that the Great Pyramid evolved from, and once I understood it properly, the rest could fall into place. The answer to the riddle is that these two rooms are not backup burial chambers. These two rooms are backup chambers of worship. The final design of the Great Pyramid was always planned. You couldn't place the largest granite block so high as an afterthought. The only thing the builders were unsure of was if the innovative design of an accessible yet secure king's chamber could be achieved. The bent pyramid's lower section is remarkably similar to the Great Pyramid's design. One enters by descending downward, only to turn upward with a high corbelled gallery to inspire awe. You then proceed to a chamber with a chimney-like structure which spiritually connects you to the burial above. But for the Great Pyramid, this was only a failsafe in case the King's Chamber portcullis didn't work as planned. The goal all along was for visitors to ascend all the way into the King's Chamber and pay their respects directly. This is why the Queen's Chamber has air channels that were never finished, in addition to its unfinished floor and unfinished threshold. It's also why the Queen's Chamber was covered under the floor of the Grand Gallery, so that it would be hidden and forgotten if everything went according to plan. The reason the soaring Grand Gallery and King's Chamber look so impressive is they were designed to inspire awe among the living. Not a one-time deal for a funeral procession, but to entice people to pay their respects over and over. Room service for eternity. That seems to be the general idea. This reveals the true genius of the Great Pyramid. It's not a mountain of stone to keep people out. It's a mountain of stone to keep people coming inside. A full and deep realization that no stone barrier will ever stop intruders if a burial is abandoned, and that only the living can protect the dead. It explains why the entire Gizeh necropolis is designed in a tightly organized manner around the Great Pyramid, and even why Khufu was able to build the largest pyramid of all time. The power of a king depends on buy-in from his inner circle, the elites of society who run everything on a day-to-day manner. These elites who could make the Great Pyramid happen would be rewarded with a burial under its shadow, the umbrella of protection afforded by a monument that could never be forgotten. And none of these mastabas at Gizeh were ever built with a portcullis because of this new understanding of what tomb security really is. Building the Great Pyramid so large was not an irrational burst of spiritual fanaticism. It was a rational response to the observation that big, impressive structures attract the curiosity of mankind. And there you have it, this crazy YouTube conspiracy video, which claims the Great Pyramid of antiquity is the same as the Great Pyramid of today. A monument that draws people inside to see miracles made in stone. On this channel, I have been critical of Egyptology at times, but I do want to acknowledge the hard work of the many forgotten individuals whose contributions made this video possible. Not long ago, we didn't even know which pyramid belonged to which pharaoh, nor the order of their construction, and just solving that was an enormous job. I am standing on the shoulders of many explorers, archaeologists, and researchers whose documentation allowed me to set upon this adventure. I will also try not to begrudge those who disagree with me. This is a big change, and change never comes easy. But I don't envy those who will take up a position opposing this work. There's a classic criticism towards purveyors of ancient aliens or lost civilizations that such ideas discredit the intelligence and capabilities of the Egyptians. This is a criticism I mostly agree with. But anyone dismissing this video as amateur nonsense will now find themselves on the other side of that criticism. For it is they who will be claiming the ancient Egyptians were great fools and that their tomb security was naive and capricious. It is they who will insist the pyramids were plugged up, even though no physical evidence exists for such plugging. It is they who will insist the Egyptians could not learn from their mistakes, and designed vulnerable portcullises and pyramids again and 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 again. And it is they who will claim the genius which manifested these stone giants never considered building so big would attract the attention of humanity forever. When I started this research, I wasn't aiming to rewrite history. I only wanted to know why the pyramids were built the way they were built. It seemed to me that given the time and effort to make them, every decision would be well considered. I expect people will argue about ideas in this video long after we've faded into history. That's what makes it fun. We'll never get it exactly right. The goal is simply to be less wrong than what came before. So, what can I say? May the best explanation prevail. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Please subscribe to the channel to see more of this content. Give a like or comment as you see fit. And above all, remember to ask your friends if they take their history for granted.